Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, whatever. My name is Carlos Brandão. On behalf of the Confraria da Governança, I'd like to welcome all of you to this meeting in partnership with Insper. We are honored to have co-organized this meeting together with AMEC and CFA Brazil. For those who don't know, Confraria is a group of practitioners in corporate governance. We are members of board of directors, board committees, fiscal councils, and all of us have a previous experience as business executive or auditors and investors. In our meetings, we allocate at least half of the time to Q&A and debate with the participants. So we encourage all of you to make questions that can be made using the chat or raising your hands. And the questions, if you wish, can be made in Portuguese too, which will translate. Good morning. Thanks. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our host, Luis Vieira from Insper. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and afternoon, if there are people with different time zones here. It's a pleasure, in the name of Insper, to host this third or fourth event of Confraria, and in a team that is very important and very key to us, which is a stewardship culture in Brazil, and how can we develop that. My name is Luis Vieira. I'm a professor here at Insper, and I also teach and do research on this area of governance and stewardship. So it's a pleasure to have you all here, and without further ado, pass to you, Geraldo.
Okay. Can you hear me well from here? I think so. Well, thank you very much for coming, for all of you coming. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss stewardship as a development, that a culture that we are looking and trying to develop for many years, and this is the main discussion of our meeting today. You might be asking why I'm here. I'm here because Fabio Coelho, which was supposed to be the moderator, unfortunately, he had a meeting with our regulator this morning, and he couldn't be attending, so he might be coming through Zoom video as well. But we have here our good friend, our Professor Stephen Davis from Harvard Law School, that's going to be talking to us about stewardship, the International Oversight Committee, if he intends to, and gives a lecture about stewardship for all us to open the discussion. We have Mauro, which is, of course, one of our professors today, with a large experience in corporate governance in Brazil, and one of the ones to have started this introduction of the stewardship culture in Brazil, which is a key component of our debate today. And Claudia Chapman, which was also invited to be part of this panel, has sent us a message yesterday night saying that her mother was very ill, and she would have to have a meeting with the doctors, and she couldn't be attending, but she will come to attend another meeting that we are organizing in the forthcoming months. And and we are very glad to also to announce Isabella Saboia, which is also a very well-known and experienced non-executive director, working in this area for over 20 years. So she's going to be a very good debater here with us today. And so I again thank you for you coming, for the invitees to be coming here. And I'll leave the first word to Professor Stephen Davis to start his presentation. Professor Davis, the screen is yours, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geraldo, and thank you, Insper and the Confraria. I'm delighted and honored to be with you today. I know the people in this room have been at the forefront of corporate governance issues in Brazil, in practice, on the investor side or on the corporate side. And stewardship, as has been discussed, is a relatively new part of the sort of the architecture of governance around the world, new at least compared to corporate governance. And really what it is a change in the way the investors behave in engagement with companies and in voting at companies all over the world. It is not confined to any one market, because stewardship, as it has arisen, is being applied by large institutional investors, not just in their home markets, but in essentially every market. So what I'd like to do today is kind of give a kind of a brief picture of where I see the scene going at an international level. I understand that that each market has its own characteristics, and that stewardship in one market may not arise in the same way in another. But because of globalization of the capital markets, we also know that when stewardship arises in a certain way in a big market, like in the US or in the EU, those kinds of institutions will apply their behaviors all across the world. And that will in turn have a kind of a knock-on effect in Brazil as well as other markets. So let me get started, if I might, with a kind of a I think the big reason why we've seen this migration of investors into stewardship, and I'll speak for a moment about what stewardship really is, because I think we all need to have a kind of common definition. But if we think about what has motivated the change here, I think what it is, and again, it may not be something that applies in Brazil, but it certainly has applied in the EU and in the United States and in North America generally. And that is the rise of an investor class with radically different expectations of their financial agents. And what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the generational change in expectations. We have the rise of millennials as a class of savers. Obviously, not everybody is able to save, but for those millennial investors, young working people who have the benefits of retirement savings, they represent a very different cohort of investors than their parents did or their grandparents did. 75% of millennials want investments to do social good. So it's not just about enhancing value over the long term, it's enhancing value while at the same time doing social good. And interestingly enough, the data show that women are twice as likely as men to consider investments that deliver both positive returns and make a positive impact. So this is important because over the next several decades, something on the order of 30 trillion US dollars of wealth will be gradually transferred into the hands of millennials. So that within 10 years, 66% of consumer wealth just in the United States will be controlled by women. And so that will have again, a knock-on effect of different expectations that these savers have for their financial agents. So what do they expect? What do these investors at the grassroots, the main capital providers for the big institutional investors, what does that mean for the capital market generally? And the answer is, I would say there are three great transformations that are underway now and which I would expect will remain in place for quite some time. So let me start with the first one, which is stewardship. Stewardship. What is stewardship? I think we all need to have a good, clear idea about that. The main investor discipline up until recently was buying and trading shares and selling shares, buying, selling. But now there's an emphasis on the stewardship aspect, which is the ownership aspect. In other words, once you buy shares as an institution, what do you do with them once you hold them? Whether it's short-term, whether it's medium or long-term, how do you behave as an owner in order to protect or enhance the value of your holdings? And this really boils down, this is what stewardship is. Stewardship is the exercise, to be technical, is the exercise of responsible care by an agent acting on behalf of an ultimate owner. That's kind of the quick definition of what stewardship is. And if we want more detail, now there are more than 24 stewardship codes that have arisen around the world, starting with the UK, but now really spread really right across the world. There are new ones popping up almost every day. But they give a clearer definition for each market, what is expected for stewardship behavior on the part of an institution. And those kinds of codes address issues like, voting transparency, responsibility to engage with companies, how much should you disclose about your stewardship activities. But altogether, they are designed to enhance the ability of investors to figure out how they should be an owner that enhances value in investments, using the tools available to them in each market to enhance the value of holdings that they have. So in other words, not just buying and trading. This is a really distinct and maybe parallel discipline within the investor community, which is stewardship. There's a kind of a related stewardship angle which is arising now, and that's called, just so you're aware, beta stewardship. And that means investors engaging not only with specific companies about change at a specific board or industry sector, but it is about engaging with a market as a whole through public sector authorities, say securities commissions or legislators. So it's trying to change the architecture of a market as a whole, and that would be investors engaging in what's now known as beta stewardship. So I want to drill down a little bit on this, again, thinking about this first big transformation of, which is the rise of stewardship. And I want to talk or give you an illustration of this. Some of the big funds, and here I'm thinking BlackRock and State Street Global Advisors, two of the largest pools of capital asset managers around the world. They, 3, 4, 5 years ago, they wouldn't have touched these issues with a barge pole. It just was, they were really just interested in the narrower sense of enhancing value or buying and trading, but not using stewardship tools. So here, to give you an illustration, in 2019, Larry Fink, who's, as you'll be aware, CEO of BlackRock, he said this: as wealth shifts and investing preferences change, and that's really what I was just talking about, the rise of the millennial class of investors, environmental, social, and governance issues will be increasingly material to corporate valuations. So in other words, he's saying these ESG issues, environmental, social, and governance, essentially amounting to stewardship questions, that these are issues now that BlackRock will take into account when buying a company and owning a company over time. So let's look at, similarly, State Street Global Advisors CEO Cyrus Taraporevala was even more practical and maybe more explicit in his 2020 annual letter. And he said, quote, "We believe a company's ESG score will soon effectively be as important as its credit rating," unquote. So this again shows this is how the big investors are seeing stewardship. It is now a question of looking at all these issues, governance, environmental, social characteristics of a company, and using stewardship tools to protect value and enhance value over time. There was a headline in the Financial Times a couple of years ago, which said this: "Jobs bonanza in stewardship and sustainable investing teams." Now that's exactly right. The FT caught this as it was happening, which is that in the last 3 years, there has been at least a doubling of stewardship professionals, that's what they're now called, within investing institutions. And their job is to perform this ownership function within institutional investors. And of course, the question arises, and the FT raised it at the time in the following manner. The FT said, or quoted somebody as saying, and I happen to agree with this, "I'm not sure boards are ready for all of this stewardship that is coming their way because of all of these hires." And I think that's true. There are not many companies that I think have appreciated the change and really a rapid change towards stewardship and the development of the stewardship discipline within institutions. So let me give a couple of other quick examples. Climate is an example where stewardship has risen as a factor for companies as well as markets generally. And it's through collective action or collaborative action on the part of various investor bodies through for example, the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, or other sector-specific or topic-specific collaborations, such as there's something called the Net Zero Asset Managers Group, or Climate Action 100. These are all groups that have come and that have arisen to bring investors together on issues around the environment. And I would just point to one dramatic turning point in this respect, which was in 2021, just last year. Investors led by a relatively small hedge fund were able to, and this was completely unprecedented, but they ousted 3 directors at ExxonMobil at Exxon's annual meeting. It was a kind of a shocking outcome, but there could be no greater signal of the rise of stewardship, because that vote could not have happened in a majority without the large institutional investors exercising their vote behind that one small hedge fund. So that was a very significant example. Another example of the rise of stewardship is issues around diversity of boards and diversity of staffs, as well as health and safety. And we know this with the pandemic. There's been a lot of rising investor concern with the S in ESG, that is to say the social factors. And there was one study Federated Hermes did, again, one of the large institutions, and they concluded a year or so ago, quote, that companies with poor or worsening social practices consistently underperformed their peers by 15 basis points each month since the beginning of 2009. So in other words, investors, big institutions, are engaging in stewardship, not just because they are getting pressure from their underlying citizen savers, as I talked about at the beginning, but also because increasingly there's evidence that shows that companies that do well on ESG factors actually do produce, not all the time, but do produce better returns and lower risk over time. And that goes for diversity as well. So there's been a big effort on the part of investors to engage with companies about making sure their boards are diverse. And this makes sense because too often, and this is absolutely true in the United States, where I am based, and also many other markets, it's true that even though you may have companies that are multinational, operating worldwide, Facebook is a good example of this, operating worldwide. Facebook's own biggest market is not the United States. One of the biggest markets, in fact, is Brazil, but there's India. But if you look at the board, at least as of the last time I looked up to a year ago, there were no non-Americans on that board. So that's an example of questions of diversity. Many other times you have companies with a, let's say, an all-white, all-male board, which in other words, produces the risk of a monoculture, in effect, at the top of the company, even though there is very diverse factors involved with consumers, workers, multiple jurisdictions that companies may operate in. So investors are concerned about being exposed to heightened governance risk if the board is not diverse, does not have eyes on the diversity of the risks and opportunities available to that company. So that's a big factor within stewardship. Of course, just to wind up on this one point about the big transformation of stewardship, there is a big question about whether investors are capable of undertaking effective stewardship. Many of them have conflicts of interest. Many of them are way under-resourced when it comes to stewardship. Sometimes their pay structures are misaligned. In other words, say fund managers are getting paid for short-term, or they're getting bonuses and incentives based on short-term performance, when in fact underlying investors may be much more interested in long-term. So there are a lot of questions around whether investors are capable of doing this. Interestingly enough, one of the big changes that has occurred is the fact that, as we know, companies have long been subject to scrutiny by all sorts of people. Now investors are getting scrutinized. The Morningstar, for example, is just one, but there are NGOs. They are now looking at investors, institutional investors, to see and test and compare how they perform their stewardship functions in markets. So they're getting a lot of scrutiny. They're sort of now having to sort of swallow a medicine that they have long doled out to companies. And as a result, they are also changing. So let me briefly touch on two other transformations. The second big one I would mention is the rise of benchmarks, standards, and rules. And all of this relates to stewardship, but I would just mention this rise of new standards, both by the public sector and by the private sector. Now, what do I mean by this? In the wake of the global financial crisis, there was a sort of an assumption on the part of governments in many parts of the world that really government can't keep up with regulations, or rather with changes in the marketplace. Regulations are too slow, too rigid. And so let's empower the investors to police the market on many issues. Let's give them the powers that they need to do it. And government should step back and let investors do it. So that's, if you look at Dodd-Frank in the United States, or the Shareholder Rights Directive, earlier iterations of it, that was the thinking behind government at that point. Let's let the investors take on the market and make sure that they can police against fraud and other things. Well, the new model is very different, which is, yes, let's let the investors police the market, but now let's also intervene and provide higher standards, higher requirements, higher disclosure rules on issues like ESG, on climate change, on human capital management. So you have the EU beginning to require a vast new set of disclosures on the environment, on human capital management. We have had a sharp U-turn in the United States under the Biden administration in terms of what its requirements are on companies to disclose on environmental matters. Japan has spent a lot of time now requiring companies to report according to new environmental standards. And you also have, not just on the environment, but also issues around diversity. The EU is now requiring much more that companies have diverse boards. Japan now has a stewardship code that it imposed. And the new iterations of the Shareholder Rights Directive in Europe have a lot more regulation involved. So we're seeing a lot more intervention on the part of government, raising disclosure standards on a variety of capital market matters. But it's not just the public sector. New standards and rules are emerging from private sector as well. There are something on the order of 230 standard setting initiatives worldwide right now, and that includes accounting standards, environmental. There's a new International Sustainability Standards Board. There are stock exchange listing rules that are jumping in with higher standards of disclosure. There are new stock index providers with eligibility rules, and investor coalitions and NGOs are setting daily new net zero and other ESG benchmarks. So this is a big new change that we have seen, and it means that stewardship arises in this context where there are a lot of new standards that companies and investors need to meet. So let me touch briefly, and then I'll finish with the third, I think the third great transformation that has been seen in the market, and that is the rise of new measurement tools. So you've got new stewardship, you've got new standards, and now there's a new industry arising with new entrants all the time, some of them specialized boutiques, using big data or AI. Some of them legacy consulting firms or accounting firms that are bolting on new analytics advisory shops. Bloomberg terminals now offer 140 million ESG data points. So Bloomberg is one of those. They're offering big data. There's and some of these industries or some of the advisors focus on single industries or single sectors. It's a very diverse industry and very detailed. So that it used to be where investors may once have been able to say, we want a company to be, greener, whatever that means. And at that time, and we're talking about 3 or 4 years ago, it was purely at a hypothetical, general level when investors would say that. We want a greener company. Well, now there are data analytics that look at things very detailed, very micro level analysis, water usage, emissions, employee turnover, brand trust, all of these kinds of characteristics which form what used to be called intangible aspects of a company's value. They're no longer so intangible. This is an industry that's trying to make ESG tangible, in effect, and very detailed. And it means that investors have to skill up to understand how to use this data. It also means companies have to realize that there are lots of new players in the capital market who are using information about them, about their companies, that may not be in the control of the companies themselves. The data may be coming from outside the company, again, using all sorts of new sources. So the rise of this kind of an industry makes for a very different market. It means that, for example, there are credit raters that now can use detailed data for ESG ratings of companies. Groups like MSCI or Sustainalytics, ISS, CDP, the S&P, or FTSE for Good. Some of them are index providers. Some of them are stock exchanges. They're using this data in ways that characterize and rate companies, and that in turn stewardship professionals use to determine what their risks are, what their ESG risks and ESG opportunities are within portfolio companies. So that's kind of I've spoken much too long, I'm sure, and I apologize for that. But this is maybe I'll end with a brief, if you'll forgive a joke. But there's some countries and some companies that feel like this is a stewardship issue is not really in their market. It's not something they have to deal with. And it reminds me it's always reminded me of a story of a rabbi who goes in the holiest day of the year to the synagogue and says to everyone, he wants to grab their attention, and he says, I want everyone to understand, everyone in this congregation is going to die. And of course, there's a stunned silence, except for one man in the front who starts laughing. And the rabbi thinks, well, I don't know, maybe he didn't understand me. So he repeats, he said, everyone in this congregation is going to die. And again, the man starts laughing in the front. So the rabbi says, well, I better find out what's wrong with this chap. So he walks over and sits down next to him and says, look, what I was trying to tell everybody is I want them to focus on the big issues, the most important things. And so I want them to concentrate their minds by realizing that everyone in the congregation is going to die. And the man turns to the rabbi and he says, "No, Rabbi, that's great. It's just that I'm not a member of this congregation." So in the same way, I feel that there are companies that may not realize that they are members of this congregation, no matter where they are. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It was a great lecture from you, and the insights that I've been mentioning, and especially the new generation coming with the stewardship in their soul. That's the most important point I can see. But in Brazil, we still have a long road, to go, and I would like to invite one of the members of the executive committee of the Brazilian Stewardship Code, Isabella, to put her, her thoughts and insights about Brazil and whatever she believes to be important for us to know about stewardship in our country. Isabella, please, the screen is yours.
Okay, do you hear me well? Okay.
Yes, we do, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for Conferia to invite me, but you all know it was such a short notice, so I hope I can add value to the discussion. I'm sure most of you know that I have worked very intensively in writing the code back there in AMEC when I was invited to do it in 2016. Unfortunately, I think we have bad news in terms of stewardship. Stewardship is more than slow in Brazil compared to a speed track in UK and other countries, like Stephen said. But I see that this was the same with corporate governance principles. It also happened that we took at least 6 years before the concept of corporate governance were really adopted by companies after the launching of Novo Mercado. Novo Mercado was 2001, and I think the corporate governance practice just, was part of the corporate world in 2007. AMEC launched the stewardship code in 2006. I think it was probably the 12th code in the world to be launched. And it was supposed to start revealing investor reports in 2007. I think today AMEC was successful in transforming the code into from AMEC code to a Brazilian code. But maybe due to AMEC internal reorganization, we are now restarting the whole process, hoping to start a guidance to the signatories. I hope now that we can speed up this process, improving reports. We should have now our best shot in getting stewardship on the spotlight with all the ESG fever. I mean, this is also happening in Brazil, so maybe we can improve stewardship, putting ESG on the agendas. Stewardship, I think ESG may be our best chance to put stewardship into investors' mind, and maybe forcing them to show how they are really embracing ESG as a filter to their investments. In Brazil, I saw some strong interest in practicing stewardship by large international investors and no advance at all for local investors. However, we continue to see a high percentage of abstention in general shareholder meetings, both by local and international investors. It's still a mystery to me why international investors say they cannot nominate candidates for the board of directors. They say they can't, but I saw a few international investors nominating candidates. So for some reason, it seems more of some sort of bad or weird ruling or interpretation of a ruling by large international investors. Maybe Stephen can help us in solving this mystery. It would greatly improve stewardship if the large investors would nominate candidates. Finally, talking about board engagement, very few international investors demand this, while locals do it more in an ad hoc manner. Most frequent and very strong when they have some sort of polemic deal going on. Concluding, stewardship in Brazil is still to be born, unfortunately. Thanks, Geraldo.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Very well points that you have raised about the Brazilian stewardship level. And right now I would like to hand over to Mauro, who has been one of the, the papas of the stewardship in Brazil. And we would like to hear him about his experience for all these years implementing or spreading the word, spread the stewardship. Mauro, the word is ours, it's yours.
Thank you, Geraldo. Thank you for the whole group for the invitation. Thanks, Stephen. So good to see you and Isabella as well. I'm going to try to be creative here. Isabella is a very dear friend. We tend to agree a lot. And when we don't, it's awkward, to say the least. And Stephen as well. I've learned a lot from him. And every time I see him, I learn more. And today I was very fortunate to learn that the birth of stewardship in Brazil and what we did in the beginning of the process has a name, and it's called better stewardship. So we actually did it, and I didn't know it had a name, because stewardship becomes a reality in Brazil, especially as AMEC got involved in the Petrobras engagements in the under the leadership of Edson Garcia, who preceded me at AMEC in 2011. And back then, and in the following years, we realized that even when shareholders wanted to exercise voting rights or to be active, the architecture did not allow. And the result of this process was the BVD, the Distance Voting Bulletin, which is far from perfect, but was clearly an advance and dramatically reduced the costs, which was an excuse not to go to meetings and to vote. So thank you, Stephen, for letting me know that we did beta stewardship before the term existed. Isabella already gave an overview of the processes and challenges of stewardship in Brazil. And under the light of the global developments, I wanted to tell you a little bit of what I see here in Brazil, what I don't see, and what I think are some bad developments that we need to watch out for. First, Isabella mentioned that AMEC is making progress in its role as creator of the Stewardship Code. The fact that it's now called the Brazilian Stewardship Code, I think, is a very significant advance. The fact that we have a greater number of signatories today, even though many of them don't really know what they're doing, but at least they are in the journey of learning. So that's really good. We do see more people voting, and I think, as I mentioned, the BVD was essential for that because costs went down, and this makes the shareholder meeting more relevant. That being said, there's still a lot of lip service on both sides, on company sides and on investor sides. We are seeing more nomination of minority candidates, and the fact that Isabella points out that foreigners do not exercise this right, usually, some do, but it's an exception, increases the likelihood that locals will do it, even when they're not really very relevant. And this is a distortion of the process. So we would like to see the more relevant shareholders, be them institutions in Brazil and globally, fielding nominations when it is necessary. Because at the other end of the spectrum, we do have some large institutional investors who simply have a policy of filling the blanks, filling void positions with their own chaps, regardless of the processes at the company and regardless of dialogue. This is also something that needs to be addressed. On the stewardship practice per se, I still see very few examples of good stewardship reports. Itaú comes to mind as having the best example I've seen in Brazil. And this must be advertised so that people have a benchmark and have the opportunity of trying to improve their own reports. And we do see some specialized actions by some investors, mostly global. And here I praise BlackRock under the leadership of Gabriel Hassan, because it has moved from being a very hesitant player in terms of fostering corporate governance to a very present one. I'll come back to that in terms of agenda later. Federated Hermes always present, Rubico. And here in Brazil, we have FAMA, for example, that every once in a while has an agenda that touches stewardship, but not yet in a comprehensive way. On the other side of the table, we have very few companies that are actually leading any efforts to engage with employees. Vale is an example, and this is a seed that was planted over the past few years, and I'm happy to say that it is flourishing. Well, at the same time, what I don't see, and I would like to see, I think that every jurisdiction where stewardship has flourished has benefited from some sort of nudging, especially from regulators. And this is certainly true of the UK, of Japan, Europe, and so on and so forth. And here in Brazil, we've seen absolutely none. We've had some theoretical support for stewardship under the chairmanship of Leonardo Pereira. But since then, the CVM has done absolutely nothing to even show the market that it cares about stewardship and that it sees the fiduciary duties of investors in the broad sense that Stephen described. And as long as the regulators and clients don't see that, investors will not act and will actually resort to greenwashing or stewardship washing, whatever you want to call it. Here's another thing to find a name for. So CVM is a very absent player in this. I also think that IBGC, which we all love, is less present than it should in the debate on stewardship. I just attended a webinar on their priorities for 2022, and I haven't seen the term stewardship mentioned even once. So it's a shame that the leading think tank in corporate governance in Brazil does not see stewardship as an essential stepping stone for the improvement of corporate governance, and I hope that changes. We see some actions and some facts that are what I call examples of a half-baked attempt to move forward in terms of stewardship. The very detrimental practice of investors putting out candidates to board at the last minute, after last-minute negotiations, is still prevalent and maybe even more prevalent now than before. So this is a process that reflects a lack of dialogue or a dialogue that did not work as it should. Another thing that I don't see, and I think we have to see if we are to say that we have stewardship in Brazil, is a high-level debate on executive compensation. We don't have that. We have some voices that may eventually say something about some outrageous numbers that come out. We just saw the example of Nubank this week. And numbers taken out of context don't mean a lot. And the problem is that some of the most egregious situations don't stand out because they are very well hidden, following the norms and the law, but disclosure is so poor that we don't have a chance to bring them to light unless there's a very profound debate on that. I don't think companies want to do that. Very few companies go the extra mile and provide disclosure on compensations beyond the very bad and insufficient requirements that Brazilian law states. And even when they do, investors don't make the effort of reading them or having serious consequences out of it. So I think the time has come for people to educate themselves on compensation and the power of the incentive structure. So even more than the level per se, which is what usually brings up the headlines, it's the debate on incentive structures. I don't see board succession plans. I see companies, even when they try to produce a professional approach to board succession, they take up board evaluation methodologies, and I think that market is booming in Brazil. But there's very few, if any, efforts to disclose information on board evaluation. But that usually boils down to the conclusion that a number X of board members need to be replaced for whatever reason. And this is not being in conjunction with an idea of the lifetime of that director within the company. So you have to plan for the evolution of boards, responding to the required skills, to the performance of directors, and to the perceptions of stakeholders, but that needs to be organized. And to this date, we don't see that. We also don't see any improvements on IPO diligence. And I mean that both by the players involved in the IPO processes, advisors, banks, lawyers, and sponsors in general, but also for people buying these IPOs. So we've been through a wave of IPOs in Brazil that was a disaster waiting to happen, and some of the disasters are already happening. Companies that were not ready to list, did not make the cultural shift to becoming a listed entity and did not understand what that entailed, coming up to market and forming boards of directors at the last minute by calling one or two big shots directors to show off. The effect of multiple voting is also something that needs to change a little bit, because we are not seeing the dialogue that may eventually stop investors from requesting multiple voting. So multiple voting in Brazil is a problem. The fact that it can be requested 48 hours before the meeting brings a lot of confusion. And I still don't see the efforts to try to avoid that in some contentious situation. I don't see commitment from either side, companies or investors, to create a stewardship culture. And that is focused primarily on portfolio managers and chairmen of the boards that should have that in mind. And finally, what I wanted to highlight are some things that I call bad developments. We're seeing some hints of capture of the whole process. And the process can be captured by a number of people, starting with reference shareholders that can try to get to their objectives by using a veil of stewardship practices, but without a lot of substance. We see some situations where the board itself captures the process, sort of telling the principals what to do. And one example that I bring to mind here is the election of IBGC itself, where we have some failures in this idea of how the board should evolve in response to the needs of the organization, and instead putting too much emphasis on a so-called blueprint of how the board should look like, regardless of its history. So it's a matter of remembering that a company is a film and not a photograph, not a still picture. It's a motion picture. And this needs to be taken into account in the stewardship dialogue and in the construction of boards. Another bad development is what I call orphan companies. These are companies that were primarily governed by private equity funds or by a group of shareholders joined together by a shareholders agreement, something very common in Brazil. And suddenly these investors go away, and they don't build the structure, the culture, and the processes for the companies to engage with the new owners and thus practice stewardship as it should. We've seen companies having certain fates that were not necessary because of this lack of the creation of the stewardship processes that needed to be there. I also see some laziness on parts of investors, even when they realize that they have a role to play in the creation of corporate governance, but it's just too much work, and they don't see that as being their business. So some companies, what we call in Brazil corporations, without a controlling shareholders, are ceasing to be corporations because of laziness. Finally, I think there's been a little too much focus on priorities set somewhere else, and that do not necessarily reflect the priorities of Brazilian companies. As many of the more active voices in stewardship that do reach Brazilian companies are global, they tend to bring in the global agendas, which is understandable, but may not necessarily converge with the agendas of the companies, even when both sides have the best intentions in terms of what needs to be done in ESG. So understanding local realities is something necessary, and I don't see this taking place yet. So this is what I had to share with you. As Isabella said, it's not a happy picture. Practitioners need to be aware of this, and we need to get the word out that some of the players that are not doing their homework, starting with the regulators, need to do it. And I close with a word of optimism that was brought in by Isabella when she said that corporate governance practices had a similar journey. It is true, and I hope she's right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mauro. Very good points you have mentioned to us about still the weakness of our stewardship, but we'll get there. And just one point is if you don't even see boards talking about CEO, C-level successions, you might not expect they might be thinking about their refreshments, you know. So it's one point. But I would like to start with the Q&A with the question that Isabella had to Professor Davis. It is Isabella would like to make the question directly to Professor Davis, which is about why the overseas investors are not able to vote. Is that right?
Yeah, this is it. Like it's really a mystery to me why maybe some small investors that I see nominating, but the very large investors that are either advertising stewardship or really structuring themselves to have a better stewardship, when we ask them to nominate, they deny straightforward. And I I don't know why is that. They say it's some kind of ruling that they could be seen as a investor that is influencing in the companies, like controlling, controlling power or something. I don't know if this is true, but I don't understand. For some small investors, this is not true. For some foreign investors, this is not true. And for others, large investors, this somehow is true. So it's very confusing. I don't know if you have any insights of why this happens.
Thank you, Isabella. Professor Davis, would you be so kind to?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really honored to be on the same screen with Isabella and Mauro, who I've known both for a long time, and you two are some of the giants in global corporate governance. So I really appreciate that. I want to address that question, but I also want to sort of point out that there's this interesting difference. Mauro just was making the case that some of the foreign investors are really not in sync with local knowledge, and that they may be bringing, let's say, ESG or stewardship priorities that are developed elsewhere into a Brazil context where it doesn't necessarily work properly. And then on the other hand, Isabella is saying, we wish these foreigners would come in and, start to exert their influence. So that I think we have to figure out how to balance those two. One of the things I would respond to Isabella about is to say, first of all, I agree with you. I don't really see that there's a legal or an insurmountable legal barrier for foreign investors to nominate members of boards if that seems to be something that would be helpful. I don't see a barrier there, but at least, excuse me, legally. But I think there is another barrier, which is internal to the institutions. And even though I talked about how stewardship teams have doubled, in some cases tripled in the last few years, even at places, excuse me, like BlackRock or Federated Hermes, you still have some stark reality, which is that if you look at a place like BlackRock or State Street, again, these are the largest, some of the largest in the world, they are voting shares, let's say at roughly 20,000 annual meetings or extraordinary meetings worldwide each year. Now, the largest stewardship team that I'm aware of has about 60 people. So just do the division on that, and you realize that let's just look at those two numbers, and you would see that each stewardship professional at, let's say, a BlackRock or a Hermes or State Street, at best, has to be responsible for, doing that division, 333 companies. Now that's just not, it's not going to work if you expect each of those people to devote the attention required to really be, to do stewardship. So how do they do it? And the answer is, really, it's a question of focusing right now on the markets that in which they are most invested, where they have the most knowledge internally. And typically that may not be a market like Brazil. It's just my guess here, that it may not be, in other words, a legal barrier, but it may be a knowledge and skill and resource barrier within these institutions. They may have a significant investments in Brazil. I know that they do, but they have not yet devoted sufficient resources. And by the way, we don't know what that level of resource should be. Is 60 people the right number for 20,000 meetings a year around the world? Is it twice that number? Is it 3 times that number? nobody knows that. I would just sort of caution that we are at this moment at the we're at the infancy of stewardship. It is very new. It is maybe 3 years old at best, where stewardship has emerged, not just within the institutions as a compliance exercise. In other words, they have to vote their shares, so they just do it and it's a legal matter. But it's now not a compliance exercise, but for the most part, it's considered a contributor to value and risk management. That's a very different kind of stewardship, and we are at the beginning. So my guess is that what would bring investors, foreign investors, to play a stronger role would be the rise of local institutions doing stewardship, helping lead the way, helping identify companies that really need, for example, new director nominees, and then soliciting and bringing those foreign investors in. It's not going to be easy. I recognize that, because I think mainly the resource constraints that I mentioned earlier. But I think that's where we're seeing. And again, I would argue that this is not a unique issue to Brazil. Investors, institutions tend to prioritize their home market for stewardship, and everything else becomes secondary. We have some large institutions from Europe that have invested in the United States for many, many years. Only now, I think 2 years ago, did we see two institutions, Legal & General, Elgin, and BNP Paribas from France, beginning to offer shareholder resolutions in the United States, which is one example of stewardship. They've been invested for years in the US, but this is the first time, even though they've been very active in their home markets, in the home market in Belgium's case being Britain, and in BNP Paribas, it's France. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's really going to be a question of how do we stimulate domestic stewardship. And I have a number of suggestions on that front, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis. Isabella, you have your hands on. Would you like to make any other comment?
Yes, thank you for that, Professor Davis. I think one of the explanations that you mentioned is that foreign investors have a bunch of general shareholders meetings to fill the ballots, and a bunch of issues in that ballots. If you can send us the suggestions to how to enroll the local investors, which could be a solution to have a more, how can I say, a better environment to nominate candidates, maybe the real solutions to the local investors. But as Mauro mentioned, I think a very strong reason why they don't want to nominate candidates is that they somehow confuse that with the multiple voting, the voto múltiplo, the multiple voting, and they are really traumatized with this multiple voting, because it's a very, very complex system to go through the multiple voting. So some of them, I think, when a candidate asked for support and to nomination, they say, no, I'm not going to ask for the multiple voting. So maybe a MEC, I would say a MEC, or better than that, as Mauro said, CVM, could make some sort of, clarification that when you nominate a candidate, you are not necessarily asking for the multiple voting. This will be decided in the ballot. The only thing that the candidates are asking, it's a very low percentage to put the names in the ballot, because if the names are not in the ballot, there's no chance that an independent candidate can be elected. So maybe we are lacking this clarification that if you ask for the name to be in the ballot, it's not the same thing as asking for the the very bad multiple voting.
Thank you very much, Isabella, for your explanation and point of view for the Brazilian market. I think
Do you want me to set out some just quick thoughts about?
Yes, please go on.
So I thank you, Gerald. I think that Brazil moved very swiftly in the 90s with the Novo Mercado, for example, and Amex, especially Mauro's efforts to really talk about governance. And markets across the world improved their corporate governance in the 90s and later. And that was considered a new and important feature of capital market health and efficiency and success. Today, there is an additional measure that I think many jurisdictions consider to be an important feature of a successful modern capital market, and that is the rise of effective stewardship. And how do they do that? I'll just mention 7 examples very briefly of different markets that have moved in this direction. So in the United States, I would say maybe a principal change was an SEC regulation back about now, I think it was 2006, called the Npx Rule. And that requires big mutual funds and asset managers to disclose their voting every year, once a year. And that has opened up lots of implications. Now investors are scrutinized by how they vote. It opens up a lot of pressure on them to demonstrate that they are performing stewardship. So I would say this is one example of a market which at the public sector level has taken a step to initiate or to catalyze stewardship. Another example would be in Malaysia, where the government created something called a watchdog group of a collection of large public sector funds, and the government wanted them to play a monitoring role. So it used that watchdog group as an example for other investors, how they should perform stewardship. Italy has a third example I would cite, which is a law called the voto di listo, which requires that certain companies at a certain size have directors on the board who are appointed by the shareholders. So not through the typical board nomination process, but so you have a group, the equivalent of AMEC, called Assogestioni, which goes about the process of identifying director candidates for different boards. So that's Italy. The UK has done it through, I'm sorry, Claudia couldn't be here today, but she would have talked about the fact that the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, now does an annual survey of funds and essentially rates them or qualifies them on how well they do stewardship. So the regulator, in this case, one of the regulators, goes about the process of determining whether institutions are performing stewardship in an effective manner. The EU has done this in a different way with disclosure. Again, they require funds to issue, for example, an annual stewardship report, which shows what they're doing in this respect. And then 2 other examples. Japan put in a rule that with a stewardship code, and it sort of embedded it in government policy that there be a stewardship code to prompt the large investors, led by the GPIF, which is the largest pension fund in the world, to perform stewardship as a sort of a demonstration of for all the private sector funds. And then the last one I would mention in a similar way is sovereign wealth funds, both in Norway and the other funds too, but Qatar, for example, most recently, where they've installed someone within the Qatar, one of the Qatar pension funds and or sovereign wealth funds. And in both cases, Norway and Qatar, they have taken now a substantial role in stewardship. So I mention all these as examples of where one could imagine constructing a sort of a manifesto to help the regulators or the lawmakers in Brazil, whoever makes most sense, provide them with a set of proposals for how to enhance the capital market as others have done, and bring Brazil into that trend.
Thank you very much, Professor. And those examples will be followed by us pretty soon, especially by the Brazilian stewardship code. But talking about the investors, as we have about the stewardship of investors, we have Jaime Gorenstein from Federated Hermes among us. And I think we can hear from the horse's mouth about how they manage the stewardship of so many companies, like you have mentioned, Professor. Jaime?
Thank you, Geraldo. So Isabella, going directly to your question, there are no restrictions in terms of nominating candidates to boards. We have done that a number of times. Mauro will recall that in different markets. This year, for example, I led an initiative nominating a candidate to a Korean company. So we do that from time to time, not as a routine. So we see the nomination of candidates to board as a kind of escalation of engagement. So as a tool in the engager toolbox, when direct dialogue with the companies, with boards, with management, that doesn't work, management doesn't respond, or we don't have access to boards, we see as one of the tools we can use that try to nominate a candidate to the board. So we have done that a number of times. There are no restrictions. You mentioned a couple of points that's true in some markets where this process of nominating a candidate to a board may be seen as an interfering with management, and that may even, to the limit, not in Brazil, but in other markets, have to trigger a public offer for the company. So people have to be very careful with that in some markets. But there's another aspect, and that's more kind of a reputational, from a reputational perspective. So many of kind of the very big investors you mentioned, that maybe you have spoken with and asked for support, they see as this process of nominating candidates to the boards or certain other tools in the engager toolbox as seen as too aggressive or too assertive, and being labeled as activist as opposed to active. So we all want to be, we all have to be active investors. That's the core of stewardship. But many are concerned to be labeled as activist. And in many markets that has kind of a bad reputation. So that also plays a role, Isabella, and I know for a fact that many, they are very concerned about receiving this label of activist. And talk a little bit about AGMs, and I mean, Professor Davis is right. We at Federated Hermes, we vote around 12,000 AGMs every year. But we have an internal process to manage that. It's we don't give the same level of attention to all AGMs. So we have, for each market, we have a very detailed algorithm that applies our corporate governance principles to that market and vote in almost like an automated way, applying the rules, what our expectations for each kind of resolution, how we're going to vote. But there are a number of companies out of this 12,000, I would say that about 2,000 AGMs, these are the ones that voted manually, And that really requires my or my colleagues' interference. So there are companies, well, because of the size of the holdings, or they're the companies that are part of our proactive engagement program. And for these companies, we use engagement, we use voting as part of the wider kind of stewardship and engagement efforts. So they complement each other.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jaime. I was just trying to find out the list of the questions. I have two short questions just to raise for you all. It is when Jaime was talking about activism and active investors, and in Brazil, as you know, Professor Davis, activists or investors, active investors are known as activists, which has a perception of being a bad habit. And what I have seen, and the question I have is, first, how do you perceive short selling in the market in order to develop corporate governance? And the second question is, how do you see the index funds, which represents about 25% of the whole American market and 65% of S&P 500, as a role for a good corporate governance and stewardship? Please, thank you.
Is that for me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please go on.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, in terms of short selling has been a part of the capital market for only 400 years or so. I mean, it was started in 1612 or 1609, I can't remember, by the first ever what we now call shareholder activist, which was the Dutch East India Company. And he's Isaac Lemaire, and he became known for being the first short seller. But I think of him really as the first corporate governance or shareholder activist. And he only engaged in short selling when he failed, using what we now call engagement or stewardship to achieve his aims at the Dutch East India Company. So I think short selling is, you know, as you imply, it's a practice that, even though it has, of course, legitimacy within the capital market, it has a very poor reputation and is, I think, a lot of funds would steer clear of it. Some of their agents might not, but a lot of the big funds would steer clear of it. And but I think it's important to recognize that for many investors, before they do short selling, they're going to try to get their aims achieved through normal stewardship. And it is so your question about indexing, you know, it is an issue that today investors do use stewardship. There is this discipline of ownership, and it's kind of odd in a way that it didn't exist before, because the typical investor, like if you're an entrepreneur in the old days where you didn't have institutional investors, but you had big entrepreneurs or what we now call oligarchs, for example, they may invest in a company and then exercise stewardship, what we now call stewardship. They would want to know how their companies are doing, and they want to intervene and make sure that they play an ownership role. That only went away when big institutions came in and took the place of the entrepreneurs and now dominate the marketplace in many countries. So we're today moving back to syncing the old idea of stewardship or ownership with the rise of institutions and bringing those two together. Now, in index funds, of course, have a special issue where they once they invest in a company or a set of companies within an index, they're not of course, buying and trading in and out of those companies. If they don't like the company, they're still invested in the company. And so in a way, there's an argument that they have a lot more at stake in stewardship. They have a lot more interest because they can't sell in using all the other tools that they have available to them, namely stewardship tools, engagement with the company, voting at the company. Those are the kinds of things that index funds now are beginning to embrace and to introduce. And as I said, I think we're at the early stages. There's a big difference today as compared to 5 years ago, but there'll be a lot more difference 5 years from now than there is today. So I think index funds are going to be much more involved in stewardship. They will never be as engaged as funds that are not indexed, that are active, that are smaller portfolios, where they do a much deeper dive, hedge funds, for example, much deeper research on their individual portfolio companies, and they're much more engaged and aware as a result. That's different from, say, Federated Hermes with its 12,000 annual meetings, or BlackRock, where it does maybe 20,000 meetings a year. They can't have the deep dive and deep research on each company, at least with the current level of resources.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis. I think Mauro has some points to highlight on this subject. Just a quick point on short selling, which I think deserves a separate event. But I think it's like a knife. A knife can be a very useful instrument in the kitchen, but it can kill somebody as well. And financial instruments are not different. And among those, short selling is not different. So take the case of Squadra and IRB, maybe the most well-known case of short selling in Brazil. These guys have been short IRB for 3 or 4 years. Now, this is not a threat to the company as it is. So you may say that somebody making a very large short-term, short or long position can have repercussions for the company that would have been different in a natural state. But I repeat, that is true for both short and long. We've seen cases where long positions were also used like that. And either by people buying leverage positions in the company for the short term, situations involving empty voting, which is very common, where you just loan the shares, you vote, you don't have an economic interest. The use of long derivatives, such as in the case of GVT and in the case of Marfrig with BRF. So all these are instruments that can be used for good, for legitimate financial strategies, but can be used in a hyper-powered way for short-term gains. And eventually we may improve the regulatory framework to avoid the consequences of that use of these instruments. But I think I look at short sellers as being a very important component of the gatekeeping structure of corporate governance. And I hope they don't get stigmatized because they sell the stock. Thank you very much, Mauro. Great to hear that. Now we have Olivia Ferreira with the question, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to stewardship culture, and this is a question for all three of you. If we understand stewardship as a way of influencing, let's say, business alpha in the context of stakeholder value over time, that today may mean for companies that they need to effectively deal with new technology, sustainability, ESG. So perhaps a key gate to that influential process are board of directors. So my question is, how do you see board roles, design of the governance structures, the skills on the boards evolving first, to react to this stewardship, and second, to lead perhaps the way around when we are talking about taking the initiatives to engage and communicate with shareholders and stakeholders. And going back to Mauro's point and Isabella, since we are infants here in Brazil as well in stewardship, and you mentioned, Mauro, about the IBGC also not even talking yet about it, shouldn't we also be flourishing this culture through board of directors?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Mauro? The answer is yes, absolutely. By all means, stewardship has everything to do with boards. But just came to my mind as you were speaking, Olivia, and I know your priorities very much. I think that in a world where we had perfect diversity on boards, stewardship would even be unnecessary, because stewardship is just a way for external stakeholders to bring their views to management and implement change. Now, if diversity were perfect, these views would already be there, because we would be able to represent any other ideas that investors or other stakeholders might have. The problem is that there's, of course, so many dimensions to diversity that it's impossible to fit in an 11, not 9 or 13 member board. So we will never have that. That being said, if we make advances in diversity, I think the whole process of stewardship will be more natural, and it will bring less surprises. Professor Davis or Isabella would like to make any comments. That's okay now.
Yeah,
Go on.
I'd be happy to do that. I think that is a great question, and absolutely the right one, because the rise of stewardship has vast implications for boards that are on the receiving end of stewardship by institutional investors, both domestic and foreign. And I'll just give an example about how that might be seen differently by boards. I remember speaking with two different directors from two different companies, and I was asking this question, how does the rise of stewardship and engagement with investors, how does that change, or how do you see it? And one director said to me, well, I think this is great. Engagement is great because finally, I and the company can really set out and explain what our company is doing. We can have a true engagement experience where I can explain what we're doing, what our strategy is, and really have them understand it directly. And then I spoke to another director who's from a different company, and they said, we think this is engagement is great because I can hear from my investors directly what they think about how we're doing, and I get ideas from them, and we can incorporate them. And so it becomes a two-way dialogue. Now, if you think about those two ways of thinking about engagement, the first, let's put it bluntly, is they see it as a propaganda exercise. It's a new channel for propaganda to put our case. And the second is a collaborative a dialogue. It's a dialogue of listening. How are we doing? How do you perceive us as a company? Do you have any ideas for us? And here's what we think. Here's how we see ourselves. In other words, a two-way exercise. It's the second that is the most valuable. It's the second that's the most valuable. And the first is one where directors are not necessarily able to get out of their bubble and understand how they're perceived. And those first types are the ones like ExxonMobil, which suddenly found themselves with 3 directors having been defeated. They were shocked by this. The company was shocked. Why were they shocked? Because they did not adapt to the rise of the stewardship. They didn't realize that they were part of the congregation, as I mentioned in that joke earlier. So what I think boards ought to do is to recognize this is a different situation. What they ought to do is to consider stewardship in the same way that they would put R&D, research and development, into products. They should put R&D into stewardship. In other words, to figure out what are the investors really thinking about? How are they addressing the new issues? What issues do they have? How might investors differ from one another on environmental, for example, or social or governance matters? Some companies have taken a very practical step to do this. They've named their company secretary or whatever, their general counsel or their investor relations person as the chief governance officer, with the responsibility of understanding on a real-time basis what their large shareholders want of them, what are their expectations, and how do they vote, and how do they act in stewardship, in a stewardship context. So having a board with resources that look at those questions is important. Doing the R&D, putting R&D into stewardship, and then also think about ways to have two-way dialogue with investors that may have implications for what board member skills you're looking for on a board. You may need to have at least one or more directors, for example, the head of the remuneration committee, or the head of the nomination committee, or the head of the audit committee, who is capable of engaging on a two-way basis with investors. Those are different skills. I mean, it used to be that the skill set of the directors specifically did not involve communication with big institutional investors, particularly foreign ones. But that may be very different today. And so I think those are just some of the examples of how companies can adapt.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question from Carlos. Carlos, please go on.
Geraldo, it's a question for Professor Stewart Davis and for the others, but we see that stewardship is very good for improving the business environment together with good governance practice, ESG, this kind of stakeholder engagement, specific stakeholder engagement. I would like to listen to your comments about another important stakeholder, which are the proxy advisors, and the self-regulation regarding that with the IOC and so forth. If you could make some comments to us.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. As many of you will be aware, proxy advisors, and I would say principally, there are two large ones, ISS and Glass Lewis, and then some other medium-sized ones and some smaller ones around the world. But they have they play an important role in providing research and in some cases advice on voting for institutions. And we have, Federated Hermes has the EOS division, which does something similar. They provide services beyond Hermes, Federated Hermes' own accounts to third parties, and they perform engagement services, including voting, but also engagement, a range of stewardship services for funds around the world. So these are very important players. It isn't necessarily the case that whatever they recommend, let's say they voted, they recommend voting for or against directors in Brazil. It's not as if the investor clients that they have automatically take their advice. It's not a robotic exercise, but they do have influence, and they're a very important resource. Now, most of the institutional investors around the world are pretty comfortable with those sets of resources, with those companies and the advice they get. They may not use it all the time, but they are comfortable getting that advice. Companies, on the other hand, are not in all cases, but we know that companies are less happy with the proxy advisory industry, and they are less happy. Partly, you could argue, because they don't agree with the recommendations. But what they cite is typically that the proxy advisors have conflicts of interest, that they provide inaccurate advice or misinterpreted information, or they have too many errors, and that they give companies insufficient time, or in some cases no time at all, to review the reports that they do on individual companies before circulating those reports to investors. So that's background. And regulators in various jurisdictions have sought to take action on this matter, but no one's really stuck with it except for the European Securities Market Authority, ESMA, which 10 years ago began a process of what became known as monitored self-regulation, which is what I think Pella's referred to. Monitored self-regulation means that ESMA wanted the industry to develop its own set of best practices. And then ESMA said, that's not sufficient. We are happy that you've got your own best practices, but we want it monitored independently outside the industry. So they prompted the creation of something that's now known as the Independent Oversight Committee, the IOC. Now, I chair that as an independent chair. We have 11 members from different jurisdictions, and our job is to represent stakeholders and to oversee and monitor the proxy advisory industry. So 1 year ago, for the first time, because it's a pretty new shop, we reviewed the compliance statements by the different 5 members of the best practice principles group, including Federated Hermes. And we provided recommendations and reactions to those statements. And where we sort of felt that they fell short, that we recommended changes. This year, we're going to be reviewing, we're in the process now of reviewing the latest statements and to see how our recommendations were incorporated or not into the practices of the proxy advisors. And next year, ESMA will look at what we've done and to see whether this process of monitored self-regulation, works, and whether it's led to improvements in the industry. One of the last thing I would mention is that the IOC is responsible for reviewing the compliance reports, but also to listening to stakeholders about what they think about the proxy advisory industry. And so last year we had a virtual roundtable, or rather open forum. This year it will be a live one, as well as virtual, in Rome on October 13th, and that will be, our host will be Assa Gestioni, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is the AMEC equivalent in Italy. And at that forum, we will, openly invite stakeholders of all types to tell us what they think about proxy advisors and what changes or improvements they think we ought to pursue.
Thank you, Professor Davis. And your last report of IOC was also sent to all of the invitees on a PDF file, which was the report issued, I think, mid last year. It was in June or July last year. And
yep, July 1st, we issued our first annual report. Yes.
So we look forward to see the new ones, and good to know that we have the IOC to go after for everything we are not looking right from the proxy advisors. But just for as we are in the very last minutes of our time, I would like to ask you three, if possible, to give your last message to especially for the Brazilian market, regarding the what we are developing this stewardship culture that we need so much. Professor Davis would like to start with that, or would like to be the last one to leave the final message?
No, I think it's better for some of the folks more familiar with Brazil to provide the much broader wisdom than I can. But I would just maybe say, to follow up on a point we talked about earlier, that maybe, I don't know if it's feasible, but if we could bring together the different major players in the capital markets, such as AMEC and IBGC, and agree on a set of policy proposals for the government or for the regulator or for the stock exchange, whoever might be best, and draw from some of the ideas that have been that have surfaced in comparable markets around the world. I think it would be, and especially if it were placed in the context of stewardship now being an essential discipline of a capital market and an essential component of a thriving capital market. And the reason being that we want to have investors playing an ownership role, as entrepreneurs used to do, but to play an important role to make sure that they monitor companies against, on the downside, things like fraud and lax safety standards, things of that sort. And on the upside, to be monitoring companies to make sure that they can be the best they can be. That stewardship now is a vital component of that process and of a thriving capital market. So maybe designing a set of policy recommendations to foster stewardship in Brazil, drawing upon the successful examples of other comparable markets. That might be something timely to think about. And thank you very much again for inviting me.
No, it's up to us to thank you, but very good words, Professor Davis, and we will do our best to follow your suggestions and recommendations. Isabella, please, would you like to give a word for the final, and we leave Mauro to the closing.
Okay. First of all, a lot of Professor Davis' statements are music to our ears, both in terms of board engagement and now what he suggests in terms of policy recommendations that MEC and IBGC could, or even Confraria, could get together and put this to the regulator or to the stock exchange. I think in Brazil, most of asset managers didn't understand exactly how stewardship would be important to them. We have very few investors telling the asset managers that this is important. I don't know if I have news that some investors or clients from the asset managers really put any pressure on funds to do stewardship. So I don't know if this is going to happen, but that's what we pray for. Maybe with the pressure from clients, from asset managers, especially local ones, because I think we already have pressure on foreign funds. Maybe we see some pressure from clients, especially the institutional investors from asset managers. Maybe we get stewardship going. But thank you for the suggestion about the policy recommendation. I think we need to put all of our forces into this.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Definitely we have to work all together for this development, no doubt about it. Mauro, please. I have very little to add to what I already said. I think I've already broken a few glasses here, But I would first like to second Stephen's suggestion. I think it's great. That being said, I am very skeptical of our ability to get leadership from a regulatory or even multilateral perspective, getting any momentum here, with the exception of AMEC. Sorry, but that's just my experience. What I think can also make a difference, and hasn't been tried a lot, is that over these 20 years work on boards, I've met some very crappy directors, but I've also met some very good people and some very good directors that didn't know about stewardship simply because they hadn't been exposed to it. And once they are, they understand its relevance and how much needs to be done. So I think that there's a path forward by finding and creating champions within companies, within boards, and within the investor community. So I would devote efforts to that, because these champions will create examples, and these examples will replicate themselves. That's it.
Very good suggestion, Mauro. Really, we have to find benchmarks and examples to be followed by the rest of the market. I'll hand over to Carlos to do the final closing. Please, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldo. I think I would like to thank Fabio Coelho, who's not here, but was key in promoting this initiative, and thank the Insper team too, Ana, Daniele, and Eliana, for helping us here in this event, and thank you very much for everyone for attending.
Okay, so thank you for everyone who was here today, and I look forward to see you soon in the next. Would like to just
Yeah, brief comment. It's our intention to put this video or this recording available to other people, and anybody who can promote and do something like this would be useful. And I love your example, Mauro. I think there is a role also for educational institutions to help on this effort, bringing those champions to talk to the non-champions, let's put it that way. Okay. Future champions. That's better.
Yeah, the future champions will pretty soon will come out from this college. Okay, great. Thank you very much for all of you coming, and see you next time soon. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.